Hey everyone. So I hope you guys are doing well today and doing well as we're kind of getting closer to the end of the semester with graduation and everything coming up soon. So I'm Nora, as you probably know, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about reading disabilities. So a few of the specific things we'll talk about are dyslexia and hyperlexia, which are two of the most common reading disabilities that we see in children. And we'll also be talking about the signs, treatment options, and prognosis for both dyslexia and hyperlexia as well. Okay, so what is dyslexia? Dyslexia is a learning disorder that is characterized by difficulty with reading. Um, it's reported that many people with dyslexia have trouble with connecting letters to sounds, which is kind of like the main problem that we see in people with dyslexia. There are also some struggles with word recognition, with both accuracy and fluency. There's usually a lot of trouble with spelling within people with dyslexia, and there are occasionally some language comprehension issues for people who have dyslexia as well. So, dyslexia is going to primarily affect phonology and semantics. So, phonology, which is like the study of speech sounds, and then not the study, but speech sounds, and semantics, which is like word meaning in relation to other words within a sentence. Okay, so I just want to show you guys some examples of what people with dyslexia might see when they're reading. So different people report different like versions of what you see on the screen here. So the first one is kind of like random spacing. So like the top sentence you can see like the spacing is just like super random, not necessarily like when where it should be, like with when a word ends. So it's like randomly throughout different words. And then some people might see it just like no spaces at all, just like everything's all crammed together. Um, and then as you can see in the middle section of the screen, some people with dyslexia kind of report like that they see shadows um, of like the words that they're trying to read, so it looks like they're seeing double of everything, which is obviously something that would make it more difficult to read. And then this last one at the bottom here is the least common version. But some people say that they just see random blurry spots on the page, like polka dots almost, just like so. Yeah, that's kind of a little bit just about like what people with dyslexia might see as they're reading. Okay, so signs of dyslexia. So, and these are more for like younger children, so like preschool to kindergarten aged kids. Um, you might see some of these signs like trouble recognizing simple rhymes like cat, rat, mat, and difficulty with learning the alphabet. Um, so, and I wanted to actually answer someone's question here. So someone asked if there are specific factors that contribute to a reading disability. And for dyslexia, the answer is yes. So if there is any kind of family history with dyslexia at all, um, that child would be more likely to also have dyslexia. So there's some sort of a genetic relation, which they haven't actually figured out what it is yet, but they have noticed that like if there's a family history, then it is also more likely for that child to have dyslexia as well. And then there's also some signs to look out for older kids too, which would include the ADHD or ADD diagnosis. Um, if a child has either of those disabilities as well, then they are also more likely to have dyslexia. And older children will also feel like you'll see things like just avoiding homework or just like an excess amount of stress that seems to come along with reading, that you might not see in a child who isn't struggling with dyslexia. Um, like they're feeling just like more self-conscious about it is basically kind of like what you would see. But they obviously become a little bit more aware of that as they're getting older and going through school with like all their peers not really having as much trouble as they might have with reading. Um, I also wanted to take a minute to answer another question. Someone asked if dyslexia would be more common in boys or girls. And the answer is that dyslexia is more common in boys, but it's because a neurologist explained that the male brain matures at a different rate and seems to be more vulnerable to neurodevelopmental factors, which leads to males generally having more trouble with learning disabilities in general, and that would include dyslexia under that umbrella there. So, yeah, that's the answer to that. Yeah, I also wanted to talk to you guys about some neurological differences that you might see in like the brain of a typically developing reader versus someone with dyslexia. Um, and these examples are kind of when like the activation of the areas of the brain when someone is reading. So, as you can see in the non-impaired reader's brain, there's a tiny little activation of Broca's area in the front there. And then there's also some activation in the parietotemporal area, which helps with analyzing new words. And then the occipital temporal area is also activated, which helps make a neural model of a word, which would include things like spelling, pronunciation of the word, and meaning of the word, which is a super important part of like learning to read. Like to have that area kind of like analyzing the new words you're taking in all the time is super like beneficial to people with typically developing brains. So then, as you can see in the reader with dyslexia's brain, there is only one area that's activated, which is Broca's area. So that helps with processing articulation and connecting sounds to letters. And as I mentioned in the beginning, connecting sounds to letters is one of the biggest issues, kind of like the biggest problems we see with people with dyslexia is like they have a lot of trouble with what letter means what sound, like which one corresponds to the other. Um, so when Broca's area, and as you can see, Broca's area is like very, like more of a bigger spot in the reader with dyslexia's brain versus the non-impaired reader's brain. So that kind of means that Broca's area is overcompensating for the lack of activation within the parietotemporal area and the occipital temporal area, which is kind of what one of the things that leads to a lot of trouble with the kind of connecting sounds to letters and figuring out what word means what and stuff like that. So now we're going to be getting into hyperlexia a little bit more. So hyperlexia is also known as specific comprehension deficit. So yeah, a little bit more about it is that it is a learning disorder when a child can read exceptionally well for their age, but really struggle with comprehending what they're reading. So basically, they'll read a book with no problem. Like they don't need help sounding out words or anything like that. But they'll like if you ask them what the book is about after they finish it, they would have like no idea what they just read. So this is like different from visual word recognition in typically developing children because they don't have the word recognition tightly associated with the previous knowledge of the word and its meaning, which kind of goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about with like the areas of activation in the brain with dyslexia. There's a similar thread there. So, which is why they struggle. So yeah, hyperlexia also affects morphology, which is kind of like how words are formed, syntax, which is the sentence structure and word order, semantics, which would be like the word meaning in relation to other words within the sentence, and lastly, pragmatics, which would be the language in context, whether that be in context of like a book or in context of like social situations. People with hyperlexia tend to struggle with that as well, which we'll get into in a second. So, signs of hyperlexia include adequate to advanced word recognition skills, inadequate reading comprehension, adequate reading fluency, but poor vocabulary. And then it's also very highly correlated with autism. So it's more likely to be seen in individuals who have autism or another cognitive or social disability, but it can occasionally exist on its own as well. A clinical review actually concluded that almost 84% of children with hyperlexia are on the autism spectrum, but on the other hand, there are only about 6 to 14% of children who have autism that have hyperlexia. So it's very common for people with hyperlexia to have autism, but it's much less common for people with autism to have hyperlexia, if that makes sense. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking to you guys about kind of like the treatment options and prognoses for both dyslexia and hyperlexia. I'll go back and forth just so we can kind of compare the differences and similarities between the two. Okay, so treatment focus for dyslexia includes things like letter knowledge, phonological awareness, which would include rhyming, segmenting, and blending words, and then awareness of just like sounds and syllables within words as well. And then they'll also talk about sound syllable correspondence, sight word knowledge, which would be meaning that the child should be able to read a word without sounding out each letter. So they'll also go through reading decoding, which would be the ability to apply knowledge of letter-sound relationships, including knowledge of letter patterns, to correctly pronounce written words. And then they would also go through reading fluency, and then spelling and vocabulary are also two things that are definitely important for people with dyslexia to go through. I also wanted to mention these are kind of like things that they would go through when they're treating someone with dyslexia, but these are also the things that they test to evaluate whether or not they have dyslexia to begin with. So educational psychologists are the most commonly seen professionals to diagnose and treat dyslexia, but some children also might see their primary care physician, speech language pathologists, or neurologists, depending on what specifically they're struggling with or want to target with their treatment. So for hyperlexia, they want to focus obviously on the comprehension side of things. So they will use knowledge of the basic story structure and story components, um, figure out what their vocabulary knowledge is, which would include multiple meaning words and synonyms and antonyms. So they'll also go through understanding meaning from context, figurative language and ambiguities. So that would be words with multiple meanings and can be used in different ways in different contexts. Um, they'll also go through paraphrasing and summarizing just to kind of figure out if a child can put into their own words what they've just read, or if they're struggling with that more. And then they'll also work on implementing their own comprehension strategies. So there are things like skimming, rereading, and taking notes that different children with hyperlexia have used and has actually helped with their comprehension a lot too. And then there are some strategies they can use to kind of like self-monitor their own comprehension, which they can learn within some speech therapy or um, yeah, just to kind of so they can figure out if they're actually understanding it on their own or if they're going to need to reread and kind of focus a little bit more on what they're actually reading. Yeah, so and like I said with dyslexia, these are also things that they would test to evaluate whether or not a child might have hyperlexia. So a pediatrician would probably give out the original diagnosis, but further treatment would be carried out by an educational psychologist, SLP, or behavior technician. Okay. So now we're going to be getting into the prognoses for dyslexia and hyperlexia. First, we'll talk about dyslexia. So dyslexia right now does not have a cure, but with early diagnosis, most children are able to develop strategies that kind of just become second nature, like as they go through adulthood. So adults with dyslexia don't report too many problems with reading, which is great. So there's that. And then the prognosis for hyperlexia also doesn't have a cure, but it actually, unlike dyslexia, it generally fades into adulthood. So, in most cases, it'll fade out as the child gets older, like into their teenage years. But there are still many struggles that they'll definitely face throughout their childhood, with reading comprehension being the main issue. Okay, so we're kind of getting to the end here. So I just want to review with you guys about kind of like the difference between dyslexia and hyperlexia. So dyslexia, someone with dyslexia will have poor decoding. So they'll really struggle with like literally reading, but they'll have really good comprehension in general. And then hyperlexia, on the other hand, is basically the opposite. So they'll have great decoding, they'll do really well with reading words, but poor comprehension, just not understanding what it is that they're reading. But there is some overlap, which there hasn't been too much research on, because most people are just diagnosed with whichever, either dyslexia or hyperlexia, whichever they show more signs of. So those are called nonspecific reading disorders right now, because there just hasn't been too much research into them. And then I also wanted to take a minute here to answer one last question for you guys. So someone asked about the prevalence of reading disabilities just within the US. So there's an estimated 3 point, no, sorry, 43.5 million Americans who have dyslexia, um, which is obviously a pretty large number. And then, but unfortunately, there actually isn't as much research that's been conducted on the prevalence of hyperlexia. So the prevalence within the US is unknown, but there has been some more research about like um, the percentages within like the autism spectrum, and so there are like some estimates that way at least, which is good. But yeah, just wanted to let you guys know about that. With that, I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my my comprehension, for my present listening to my presentation, and yeah, here are my references. Hope you guys have a great day and a great rest of your semester. Thanks for listening. Bye.